She was 35 years old and had $11 to her name when her husband's brother put her belongings on the porch and told her the house was his now, by right of blood and by the word of a man who could no longer speak for himself. That man was Thomas Wexford, dead 6 weeks of a fever that had taken half the county's men in the winter of 1887, and the brother, Silas Wexford, had ridden in from Ohio with a lawyer's letter and a face like a closed door. What she had left, after the wagon and the mule and the debts were settled, was $11, a trunk of linens, and a name that no longer meant anything to anyone in Cross Timbers, Texas. So when old Mr. Abernethy told her the Icehouse down by Coldwater Creek was hazed for $3 as she'd haul off the junk and stop the roof from caving into the road, she paid it without blinking, though the building was rusted through at every seam and hadn't held a block of ice in a decade. Everyone said she was foolish. Everyone said a woman alone had no business owning a ruin. But sealed inside the earthen floor of that forgotten icehouse was something that had waited 11 years to be found. Something that would not only change the shape of her own life, but would settle a debt the whole town had forgotten it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Wexford. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, or from a season of your life that others have written off, tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight. Naomi and Vance have been raised on a rice farm outside of Beaumont, in the wet green flatlands where the air hung heavy as a hell breath through most of the year, and where her father, a quiet man named Eli Vance, had taught her two things he considered more valuable than gold: how to read the land and how to keep a ledger. Eli was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one. He had come up poor, the son of a blacksmith who had lost his shop to a bad debt, and he had sworn that no Vance under his roof would ever again lose something simply because they did not understand what they held. So he taught Naomi, from the time she was 7 years old, to sit beside him at the kitchen table with a coal oil lamp burning low, and to watch him mark down every bushel, every dollar owed and dollar paid, every small transaction that made up the slow arithmetic of family survival. She learned to read a column of numbers the way other girls learned to read scripture. And in a sense, for her father, it was scripture, the plain, unsentimental truth of what a thing was actually worth, as opposed to what it appeared to be worth, or what someone wanted you to believe it was worth. Paper doesn't lie. Naomi, he used to tell her, tapping the ledger with one blunt finger. But people surely do. Learn to read what's written before you trust what's spoken. Her mother, Ruth, gave her a different kind of education, one built not from numbers but from hands. How to preserve a harvest, how to render lard, how to pack meat in salt so it would keep through a long summer, how to store apples in sawdust so they wouldn't rot before the first frost. Ruth Vance had grown up near an old creekside ice house much like the one Naomi would one day buy for $3, and she used to tell her daughter about the men who cut blocks of ice from frozen ponds in the dead of winter, hauled them by sledge and wagon, and packed them in sawdust and straw inside thick-walled buildings so that families might have cold milk and preserved meat clear through the swelter of August. An icehouse is a kind of faith, her mother said once, only half joking. You're trusting that what you buried in the cold of January will still be worth something come July. Naomi did not know, as a girl shelling peas on the back step, that her mother's word were planting something in her that would not bloom for almost 30 years. She married Thomas Wexford when she was 22, a steady, sun-browned young man who ran cattle on modest acreage outside Cross Timbers, a small crossroads town in the Texas Hill Country built around a cotton gin, a Methodist church, and a general store that sold everything from plow blades to peppermint sticks. Thomas was not a rich man, but he was an honest one, and their 13 years together, though never touched by the blessing of children, were steady and companionable in a way that good marriages often are, full of small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. Naomi kept his books the way her father had taught her, and more than once she caught an error that would have cost him dearly, an overcharge from a feed merchant, a miscounted herd tally from a hired hand who either couldn't count or didn't want to. Thomas used to say, with a kind of proud bewilderment, that his wife could smell a lie in a column of figures the way a bloodhound smelled a rabbit, and though the neighbors sometimes found it peculiar that a woman took such interest in accounts, Thomas never once asked her to set the habit aside. It was, in its quiet way, the center of their partnership, his labor in the fields, her vigilance at the table, and between them a kind of trust that neither one of them ever had cause to question. She learned other things too, in those years. How to doctor a sick calf, how to can peaches without letting the syrup scorch, how to sit with a grieving neighbor and say nothing at all, which was sometimes the greatest comfort a person could offer. She learned patience, and she learned the particular dignity of small, careful work done well, whether anyone was watching or not. She could not have known that these were the very qualities that would carry her through the wreckage that was coming, or that a habit of trusting paper over rumor would one day lead her, quite literally, to buried treasure. The fever came through cross timbers in the last cold weeks of winter, moving from the hardwood place to the millers to half a dozen farms along the creek before it reached Thomas, and it took him in 9 days, fast and merciless, the way such fevers sometimes do. Naomi nursed him herself, boiling rags and forcing broth between his cracked lips, praying in the low murmuring way of someone bargaining with God in the middle of the night, and when he finally went still in the grey hour before dawn, she felt something in her chest go still along with him, as though her own heart had briefly forgotten its purpose. She had 13 days of grief before Silas Wexford arrived from Ohio, a stranger in a dark coat who introduced himself as Thomas's older brother, a man Naomi had heard mentioned perhaps twice in all her years of marriage, always in passing, always without warmth. Silas produced a letter, drawn up years earlier by a lawyer in Dayton, in which Thomas, young, unmarried, and apparently still tangled in old family loyalties of the time, had named Silas as heir to the family land, in absence of direct issue. Naomi had never known the letter existed. Thomas, it seemed, had simply forgotten it, the way a man forgets an old coat hanging in the back of a closet, never imagining it would one day be pulled out and worn against him. She went to the county courthouse in the nearby town of Marlin with what money she had left after the burial, and she sat across from a lawyer named Garrett Voss who read the document twice, sighed, and told her plainly that Texas law, in cases where nobles superseded an earlier deed of inheritance, was not kind to widows in her position, that without children, and without a later document explicitly naming her, the land could indeed pass to Silas under the terms of that old letter. She could contest it, he said, but it would take money she did not have and months she could not afford to wait. Naomi listened to all of this with her hands folded very still in her lap, the way her father had taught her to sit when hearing hard financial news, absorbing the blow without flinching, because flinching never once changed a number on a page. When she left the courthouse, she did not cry. She had done her crying already, alone, in the nights after Thomas died, and she found she had none left over for Silas Wexford, who was, after all, only exploiting a truth that already existed on paper, however cruel its use. Silas gave her 3 weeks to vacate, which he supposed, in some cold accounting of decency, was more generous than he might have been. She sold what she could, the good cook stove, most of the furniture, a set of her mother's china that fetched less than she'd hoped, and packed the rest into a single trunk of linens and keepsakes that told the story of a marriage now folded down into cloth and memory. When the dust settled, she counted what remained in her coin purse 3 separate times, the way her father had taught her to always verify a sum before trusting it, and each time it came to the same unforgiving total, $11.40. She was 35 years old, childless, husbandless, and standing at the edge of cross timbers with a trunk, a mule she'd been allowed to keep, and less money than most families spend on a month of groceries. She took a room above the seamstress's shop, a narrow space with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the dusty crossroads, and she paid for it a week at a time, watching her small fortune dwindle with the grim clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life reading numbers and had never once been able to make them lie to her for comfort. It was in her second week of this narrow, uncertain existence that she overheard old Mr. Abernathy complaining outside the general store about the eyesore down by Coldwater Creek, the old Icehouse, built some 15 years back by a consortium of local farmers who'd hoped to supply the whole county with stored ice and preserved meat, a venture that had collapsed, as Abernathy told it, on account of bad management and worse luck. Not 2 years after it opened, the building had sat empty and rusting ever since, its tin roof peeling back like a lid of a sardine can, its heavy timber walls sagging with rut, considered by most in town to be good for nothing but a hazard to children who liked to day each other inside. Abernathy, who had inherited the deed through a tangle of unpaid debts nobody else wanted to sort out, said he'd sell it for $3 to anyone fool enough to haul the junk and keep it from falling into the road. Naomi, standing at the edge of that conversation with her mother's old words about ice hoses and faith rattling somewhere in the back of her mind, heard herself say, before she fully decided to say it, "I'll take it." Abernathy laughed, not unkindly, and told her she was a strange sort of widow, but he took her $3 readily enough and had the deed transferred within the week, likely relieved to be rid of a property that had cost him nothing but complaints from his neighbors. The men who witnessed the transaction at the courthouse in Marlin exchanged looks that Naomi pretended not to notice. Looks that said a woman alone, buying a ruin nobody else wanted, was either desperate or simple, and perhaps both. She did not try to explain herself to them, because she was not entirely certain she could have explained herself even to her own satisfaction. She only knew that something about the old building, squat and stubborn against the creek bank, built of good thick cypress log beneath all that rust and neglect, spoke to something in her that refused, even now, even with $11 narrowed down to $8, to believe that a thing's worth was only what other people said it was. She walked out to the Icehouse the following morning with a hatchet, a crowbar, and a lantern, wearing an old work dress of Thomas's sister's that she'd altered years before and never had cause to wear until now. The building sat some quarter mile from the main road, shadowed by a stand of cottonwood along Coldwater Creek, and as she approached it in the pale early light, she could see exactly why the town had given up on it. The tin roof had rusted through in a dozen places, letting rain pour freely onto whatever remained inside, and the double doors hung crooked on broken hinges, groaning like something in pain when she forced them open. The smell that greeted her was thick and earthen, a mixture of old sawdust, mildew, and a particular mineral coldness that clings to a building meant to hold ice even long after the ice itself is gone. Inside, the space was larger than it appeared from the road, with thick log walls insulated by a cavity packed with sawdust and straw, exactly as a mother had described so many years before, and a floor of hard-packed earth littered with the debris of abandonment. Broken barrel staves, a rusted set of ice tongs, the skeletal remains of what had once been a sledge for hauling blocks up from the creek. She spent that first day simply clearing the wreckage, hauling out rotted wood and rusted metal in armloads, sweeping years of dirt and leaf litter into drift she could shovel through the door, and by the time the light began to fail, she had uncovered enough of the floor to see that it was not, as she had assumed, uniform packed earth throughout. In the back corner, farthest from the door, the ground had a curious unevenness to it, a slight depression bordered by what looked like the edge of old wooden planking, mostly buried beneath decades of settled date. Naomi, who had learned from her father never to ignore an anomaly in a pattern, knelt down and began to dig with her bare hands, and within a few minutes her fingers struck something solid, not stone, not root, but wood, deliberately laid, deliberately buried. It took her the better part of an hour, working carefully in the dying light with a hatchet in her hands, to clear enough dirt to reveal what lay beneath, a trapdoor, roughly 3 feet square, its iron ring corroded but intact, set into a shallow pit that had clearly been dug and covered with purpose, sometime long before the Icehouse had fallen to ruin. She did not open it that evening. Some instinct, perhaps the same one that had made her buy the building in the first place, told her that whatever lay beneath deserved daylight and a clear head rather than the uncertain light of a guttering lantern in a building she barely knew. She returned to her narrow room above the seamstress's shop with dirt beneath her fingernails and her mind turning over the discovery like a coin she couldn't stop flipping, and she slept poorly, waking twice with a strange, unshakable sense that something important was waiting for her, patient as stone, exactly where she had left it. She returned at first light with a stronger lantern and a length of rope, and after clearing the last of the dirt from the trapdoor's edges, she worked the iron ring loose and pulled with all the strength her grief-thinned body could muster, until the door groaned upward on hinges gone stiff with age, releasing a breath of cold, mineral-smelling air from the darkness below. A short ladder, remarkably intact, led down into a chamber perhaps 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, dug into the earth beneath the Icehouse floor, its walls shored up with the same thick cypress planking that had once, she guessed, insulated blocks of ice through the height of a Texas summer. But there was no ice down there now, and hadn't been for years. Instead, sitting square in the center of that hidden chamber, was a chest, iron-banded, roughly 3 feet long. Its wood darkened with age but remarkably preserved by the dry coolness of its burial, secured with a heavy padlock gone orange with rust. Naomi stood at the bottom of that ladder for a long moment, lantern raised, heart beating in a way it had not beaten since the day she married Thomas, and she found herself thinking, absurdly, of her father's voice telling her that paper doesn't lie but people surely do, and wondering what kind of person buries a locked chest beneath an Icehouse floor and never comes back for it. The padlock gave way easily enough to her crowbar, Russ having done half the work of destruction already, and when she lifted the lid, the hinges shrieking their protest into the buried silence, she found not gold, not jewels, but something that would prove, in the end, far more valuable to far more people. A thick bundle of documents, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from damp, along with a ledger book bound in cracked leather, and beneath that, folded carefully, a smaller collection of personal letters tied with a ribbon gone brittle with age. She carried it all up into the light of the Icehouse floor and began, with the same careful patience her father had instilled in her over a childhood of evening lessons, to read. The ledger belonged to a man named Josiah Renner, one of the original founders of the ice company that had built this very building 15 years before, and as Naomi worked through its columns, she began to understand a story that had nothing to do with bad management or worse luck, as Mr. Abernathy had so casually put it, and everything to do with a fraud so carefully constructed that it fooled an entire town. The ledger showed, in Josiah Renner's own careful hand, that the ice company had in fact been profitable in its first 2 years, quietly and steadily so, supplying not only Cross Timbers but 3 neighboring towns with stored ice and preserved goods. But a second set of figures, cross-referenced against the first with small, cramped notations in the margins, showed a pattern of skimming. Money diverted from the company's accounts into a private venture, disguised as equipment purchases and shipping costs that never actually occurred. And the personal letters, when Naomi untied their brittle ribbon and began to read, confirmed what the ledger implied. Josiah Renner had uncovered the fraud himself, had confronted his business partner about it, and had been threatened into silence. His family's safety used as leverage to keep him from exposing what he knew. The final letter, dated only weeks before the ice company's sudden and much lamented collapse, was addressed to no one in particular, written, it seemed, simply so that the truth would exist somewhere even if Josiah himself never found the courage to speak it aloud. In it, he named the man who had ruined the company and cheated dozens of local farmers and investors out of their savings, a man whose name struck Naomi with a jolt of recognition so sharp she had to sit down on an overturned barrel to steady herself. Emmett Colfax, who was, in the year of our Lord 1887, the most prosperous landowner in Cross Timbers, a deacon of the very Methodist church Naomi had attended every Sunday of her married life, and, as fate or something stranger than fate would have it, the man who now held the note on nearly a third of the farms in the county, including, Naomi realized with a slow, cold understanding, an old debt against the very Wexford land that Silas had so recently claimed as his own. The documents made clear that Colfax had not simply defrauded the ice company. He had used the capital he'd stolen to buy up notes and mortgages across the county in the lean years that followed the company's collapse, positioning himself, patiently and quietly, as a man to whom half of Cross Timbers now owed some manner of debt. Josiah Renner, it seemed, had buried the evidence rather than risk his family, and had died. Naomi later confirmed to the town records, only a year after writing that final letter, of causes the county coroner had called natural, though the timing left a small cold seed of doubt in Naomi's mind that she chose, for the moment, not to examine too closely. What mattered, sitting there in the gray morning light filtering through the Icehouse's ruined roof, was that she now held in her hands a proof of a wrong that had shaped the fortunes of an entire town for 11 years, and that she, a woman with $8 to her name and no standing whatsoever in the community, was the only person alive who knew it. She did not act rashly. She spent nearly a week simply reading and rereading the documents, cross-checking Josiah Renner's figures against what public records she could access at the courthouse in Marlin, working the columns the way her father had taught her, refusing to trust a paper until she had verified it every way she knew how. What she found only confirmed the story. Emmett Colfax's sudden prosperity in the years following the ice company's failure lined up almost to the month. With a wave of foreclosures and distressed land sales across the county, nearly every one of them ending with Colfax as either buyer or note holder. She began, quietly, to ask around, not about Colfax directly, which she knew would be foolish, but about the ice company's failure, framing her questions as idle curiosity about the strange building she bought. What she heard confirmed the shape of the fraud even where it couldn't confirm the details. Old-timers who remembered the ice company had always found it collapse peculiar, given how well it had seemed to be doing right up until the moment it wasn't, and more than one mentioned, in the careful, sideways way small towns discuss their most prominent citizens, that Colfax had come into money right around that same time, from an aunt's estate. Also, it was always said, though nobody could ever quite recall which aunt. It was Naomi's landlady, the seamstress Odessa Kirby, who first warned her to be careful. Odessa had noticed Naomi's frequent trips out to the Icehouse, had seen her carrying home a leather ledger wrapped carefully in a shawl, and being a shrewd woman who missed very little, she asked Naomi directly, one evening over tea, whether her digging had turned up something more than rusted ice tongs. Naomi, who trusted almost no one in Cross Timbers by that point, found herself trusting Odessa, perhaps because Odessa herself had weathered her own share of the town's quiet cruelties as a widow running a business alone, and she told her, in careful, measured words, what she had found. Odessa's face went pale, and she gripped Naomi's hand across the little table. "Emmett Colfax holds a note on this very building I rent," she said. "He holds notes on half this street. If what you're saying is true, and he learns you know it, you will not be a curiosity to him anymore, Naomi. You will be a threat." It was the first time anyone had spoken Naomi's given name with real warmth since Thomas died, and something in her steadied at the sound of it, even as a warning itself settled cold in her stomach. Word travels in small towns away water finds the lowest ground, quietly and inevitably, and within 2 weeks Emmett Colfax himself came calling at the seamstress's shop, dressed in his good black coat, his silver watch chain catching the afternoon light, his voice pitched to the same gentle, avuncular register he used from his pew at church every Sunday. He had heard, he said, that Mrs. Wexford had purchased the old Icehouse, and he'd come by neighborly concern to see how she was settling in, and perhaps to offer, should she find the property more trouble than it was worth, Mrs. front parlor with her hands folded in her lap in the exact posture her father had taught her for receiving hard financial news, thanked him for his concern and told him, quite truthfully, that she had found the building more interesting than she'd expected. Something flickered behind Colfax's eyes at that a small, cold calculation, and he pressed her, with the same easy warmth, on what exactly she'd found so interesting, and Naomi, who had learned from 13 years of keeping her husband's books never to reveal a full hand before she was ready to play it, only smiled and said she supposed old buildings held all manner of secrets, and left it at that. He did not ask again, but he did not leave reassured, either, and Naomi understood, watching him walk back down the dusty street toward the bank he owned outright, that she had just made herself an enemy of considerable means and very little conscience. In the days that followed, small troubles began to accumulate around her with a regularity too consistent to be coincidence. Her credit at the general store was quietly restricted, the clerk apologizing but citing instructions from the ownership. A local man she'd hired to help reinforce the Icehouse roof suddenly found himself too busy to continue the work, and would not quite meet her eyes when he told her so. Silas Wexford, who had shown no interest whatsoever in Naomi's affairs since evicting her, arrived unannounced with a lawyer of his own, hinting darkly that perhaps the sale of the Icehouse to a woman in her current state of mind had been improper, and that he intended to look into it. Naomi understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism her father had bred into her, that Colfax's reach into the county's finances and friendships was being brought to bear against her, slowly and deniably, the way a man might close a hand around something small without ever quite appearing to squeeze. She spent several sleepless nights weighing her options, aware that she possessed a truth capable of shaking the whole foundation of Cross Timbers, and equally aware that possessing it did her little good if she had no way to make anyone believe her before Colfax found a way to silence her, as she now suspected. With growing unease, he might once have silenced Josiah Renner himself. It was Odessa who suggested the answer over another late evening of tea and quiet planning. Rather than confront Colfax directly, or trust the matter to a county sheriff who was, by more than one account, beholden to Colfax for his own mortgage, Naomi ought to take her evidence somewhere Colfax's influence did not reach to the state banking examiners in Austin, who Odessa had heard through her sister's husband, being quietly investigating irregular lending practices across several rural counties for the better part of a year. Naomi spent 3 days composing a letter she rewrote a dozen times, laying out Josiah Renner's ledger figures alongside the public foreclosure record she'd gathered at Marlin Courthouse, presenting the pattern with the same cold, careful clarity her father had taught her to bring to any set of numbers, and she sent it by registered post along with copies of the most damning pages, keeping the originals locked once more, ironically enough, inside the very chest that had held them buried. For 11 years. The examiners arrived in Cross Timbers on a hot morning in late July, 3 men in city suits who spent a full week going through the bank's record with a thoroughness that left the whole town holding its breath, and what they found, once they had cause to look, unraveled far more quickly than anyone but Naomi might have predicted. Colfax's fraud, once suspected, proved easy enough to trace through his own bank's ledgers, which showed the same pattern of inflated fees and quietly manipulated foreclosure timelines that had let him accumulate, over 11 patient years, an empire built on other people's misfortune. He was arrested that August, on charges that would eventually see him stripped of his bank, his land, and most of what he'd stolen. And in the reckoning that followed, the state examiner's review of his foreclosed properties turned up something Naomi had not anticipated but received with a quiet, aching satisfaction. Nearly a dozen improperly foreclosed farms, including, buried deep in Colfax's own paperwork, the very note against the Wexford land that Silas had used to justify Naomi's eviction. A note the examiners determined had been fraudulently inflated years before Thomas's death, meaning the debt that had partly justified handing the farm to Silas had never been the size everyone believed. Silas, faced with an unwinding he had not seen coming and no longer eager to fight a woman who had just brought down the county's most powerful man, quietly agreed to a settlement. Naomi's lawyer, Garrett, was the same man who had once told her plainly that the law was not kind to widows, like, and negotiated on her behalf, restoring to her a portion of the property's value in cash, more money than Naomi had held in her hands at any point since Thomas's death. She could have taken that money and left Cross Timbers altogether, and no one who knew her story would have blamed her for it. Instead, she used it, along with the recovered value of a dozen other wrongly foreclosed farms, to help establish what became known, within a year, as a cold water cooperative, a modest but sturdy institution built to offer fair credit to the farmers Colfax had squeezed for over a decade, with Naomi herself, given her uncanny gift for reading a ledger and smelling a lie in a column of figures, appointed as its first bookkeeper and, before long, its trusted steward. The Icehouse itself she restored rather than abandoned, replacing its rusted roof and rotted timbers with the same patient care she'd once given her father's evening lessons, and it stood, once more, as a working icehouse for the town, though everyone in Cross Timbers came, over time, to call it something else entirely, half in jest and half in genuine reverence. Naomi's house. The place where a widow with $11 and a foolish $3 purchase had quietly restored to a whole county what one greedy man had spent 11 years stealing away. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began. A woman of 35, cast out with almost nothing, who paid $3 for a rusted ruin nobody else wanted, because somewhere deep beneath her grief she still believed, as her father had taught her and her mother had shown her, that what is not always visible on the surface of a thing, and that patience, paired with an honest reckoning of the facts, can uncover treasures far more lasting than gold. Naomi Wexford did not set out to become the woman who exposed Emmett Colfax, nor the woman who rebuilt a broken system of credit for an entire county of struggling farmers. She set out, simply, to survive with dignity, to keep faith with the careful habits a parent had given her, and to refuse the easy, bitter conclusion that a discarded thing, whether a building, a ledger, or a widow written off by her own family, had nothing left worth finding. What she found beneath that icehouse floor was not merely a chest of old papers, but proof of a truth her whole life had prepared her to recognize, that the value others overlook is often the very value that saves us, if only we are willing to kneel down in the dirt and dig. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Naomi's story tonight. If her patience, her quiet courage, and her refusal to be written off moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share this video with someone who might need reminding that forgotten things and forgotten people still hold their worth. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? We read every story you share with us, and we're always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.